I think I'll go through the presentation, but I'm going to leave quite a bit of time for questions. So also, if you've got something that is really bothering you as I'm going, just stick your hand up and I'll try and fit you in. This is meant to be a learning and engagement for you, rather than for me to sort of demonstrate my knowledge and skills. Okay, so HTA, just very briefly, HTA Design is a 50-year-old practice that's gone through a few iterations. So in the history books, we'd be Hunt Thompson Associates for quite a while, and then we became HTA Architects, and now we're HTA Design, and that relates to ownership patterns. So if any of you are setting up a practice, start off with a simple name that you don't need to change at any point in your history that can cope with different ownership structures. And for God's sake, don't call it after yourselves. Figure out something else that is not your own personal names, because then no one else can take it on after you. We're a housing specialist practice. We don't really get involved in projects which are not housing led. We don't go looking for education projects. We don't go looking for churches. We don't go looking for commercial projects. But these days, a lot of our projects are mixed use, so they have numbers of different things going on in them, but they're usually housing led. So they start off with 50, 80, 90% housing. We also have a substantial landscape architecture team of about 25 people, and they do the external works, including on this project, the landscape architecture, as well as doing parks and recreation areas for other clients and significant public realm projects. There's my team, which is a sustainability focused team. So a lot of my team have done masters, or are architects or engineers who have done masters in environmental design in one place or another. And we have a planning team. So we try and bring all those disciplines together, because the task of creating modern, well-designed, sustainable living is a complex task which needs lots of different disciplines to interact. So we try to solve that problem by bringing them all together under one roof and talking to each other all the time. We still struggle to persuade clients to engage all of those different disciplines. So sometimes we do, like on this project, and sometimes one or two of the disciplines will work on a project, and sometimes it's all of us. We also have a long history of working on government-sponsored or housing association-sponsored or local authority-sponsored housing projects. So we worked on the Millennium Communities projects. We won the master plan for the Grange Millennium Village with Ralph Erskine in 1997. We then worked on the John Prescott-sponsored. Of course, some of you probably weren't alive in 1997, but anyway, we worked on the John Prescott-sponsored Design for Manufacture projects in 2005, and we built 2 of those. And then the second one, that one, the Design for Manufacture, we did with Barrett's. And we had a lot of other projects with Barrett's in the intervening years. And then when the Carbon Challenge was launched in 2007, we persuaded Barrett to work with us to enter that competition. And as you said, Matt, a lot of the architecture community entered that competition. It was a 2-stage competition. I led that competition for HTA and was very pleased that we won. We won by a very small margin. And one of the reasons we won was because we contradicted the brief in one particular area. So kind of a lesson when you're kind of entering competitions or responding to briefs. If something really bothers you and you think, that's just not right, sometimes you go with your gut instincts and you say, I hear what you say, but I don't think you've got the brief right. So the part of the brief said we should put housing in a listed building on the site, which I'll show you in a moment. And we decided that wasn't a very good idea, so we didn't do that. And that probably won us the competition. So in terms of sustainability and sustainable design, we're interested in getting into the mass market. We're interested in getting a wider appeal, getting things that are widely adopted, identifying a sustainable product that sells in the UK speculative market if possible. introducing the idea of sharing services. So a lot of Hanham is about sort of sharing things, it's about people working together as a community, and demonstrating that this is attractive. Nobody wants to be told, really, that you can't have what you want, that you have to give up some of your aspirations and hopes and dreams in order to live a sustainable lifestyle. That's a really difficult message to get across to people. What you need to do is develop a sustainable proposition which is attractive to them, which says you can have a lovely life here and you're going to be really sustainable while living it. So this particular scheme set out, and it has the most demanding brief that I've ever seen. So every standard that they could find, that they could lay their hands on, what was then the Homes and Communities Agency put into the brief. So Building for Life, which is about homes being flexible over their lifetime, lifetime homes, Secured by Design, which is a security standard. Homes and Communities Agency have their own space standards, so they wanted to exceed those space standards. Tenure to be mixed across development. So this is the idea that you've got mixed affordable and shared ownership and private for sale homes. So open market or housing association owned homes, but there shouldn't be any visible differences between them. This is sort of concept of pour doors, where you can clearly see where the people who can't afford to buy their home, you can see where they live. So this project aimed to avoid that. Then we had some technical standards, SIPC overheating as it was then, which limited the amount of time we could go above a certain temperature. The SEQUEL standard, which is all about the environmental quality of the external environment, and then BREEAM Excellent for the listed building. And then Code for Sustainable Homes Level 6 for all the housing. So the site in Hanham, actually, how many of you have been there? Have any of you been there? One, two, three, four. So I suggest you go there. Just go there on a Saturday afternoon, have a walk about, take your bike because it's connected to the cycle routes, so you can cycle around the scheme. It's, as you can see, it is surrounded by quite different things. So you've got a motorway here. You've got greenbelt land here, which is mounded up. So when they created the motorway, they sort of created a barrier. So when you're in this part of the site, you can hear the motorway, but you can't see it. The site itself was this area here. And in the middle of it, there's a new NHS facility for people recovering from addictions. So before they sort of go back into normal life, they spend some time here. So it's a sort of a short stay facility. And then there's a doctor's surgery here. And then around it, you've got 1950s homes. And down here, you've got some 1970s, late 1970s homes. So suburban area with an old, very old, centuries old listed structure, Hanham Hall itself. And then around here, you had a load of low-rise bungalows, essentially, buildings which were originally housed people with mental health problems. So they lived on the site. It was a residential facility. That was closed down in about 1980, 85, and then the site was left vacant. Really, it was starting to fall into ruin, and there were a lot of concerns about the hall itself and its sort of long-term life. So, it looked a bit grim and drab when we went to visit it. And you can see that this is a building which has grown over hundreds of years. So I think it started here about 1750, and then as they got richer, they sort of built a bit, and then they built another bit, and then they built a big bit. And then somebody lost it all, I think, in a card game in about 1885. So, watch out for those card games. And in front, the frontage, which looks south, has a very beautiful sort of aspect with a sort of a formal lawn and some rather ancient yew trees, which we had to keep. So on top of all the other constraints, top of all the technical constraints, we also had some really, really lovely landscape which we had to keep. So we designed a scheme which tries to retain the best of the site in landscaping terms, but also tries to connect or retain some of those connections to the countryside. There were some planning restrictions, so the planners wouldn't let us build on this section at all because they wanted to separate us from the existing dwellings, and also one of the local councillors wanted to retain a view from here to the Hanham Hills up here. But the Hanham Hills have a kind of a historical significance in the Methodist movement. I think a lot of the original mass congregations and preaching events took place there. So it's sort of a local historical significance. So we couldn't build on that part of the site. And this part of the site here was greenbelt land, which we didn't own. But it became fairly obvious during the early parts of the project that we couldn't achieve some of the standards without more land, which is a slightly odd thing to say. So code level 6 was essentially a series of demanding standards, and you had to do certain things to meet the standards and get points, and you added up your points at the end, and the number of points told you whether or not you were code level 4, 5 or 6. So we just had to get practically all the points in the standard, and one of them was you've got to increase the ecological value of the site. Well, because we were building on a chunk of it, we were restricted by how much ecological value we could gain. So we persuaded the client to take out a long lease on this piece of land so we could use that as an additional part of the scheme. We also had to retain the connection to this avenue here. So the view of the Hall, which was really the most important historical part of the building, the view of that Hall from the south, there was an existing piece of land here left in the neighbouring development, so we wanted to continue that and retain this formal structure. So you've got a sort of formal landscape structure here to the south of the Hall, and then you've got an informal east-west link here, which is sort of the spine of the development leading back to the greenbelt. So you still, from this hill, you still see the frontage of the Hall, and from the entrance to the Hall you see out here to the greenbelt. There was an existing stream which ran along here, a very low level stream, so we used that to drain the surface water. Having cleaned it, we could use that to drain away the surface water and also augment that pond. So trying to work with the natural parts of the scheme as much as possible. And then areas like this line here, an existing hedgerow, here, 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 here. So protecting and retaining as much of the existing vegetation as possible, and you see the yew trees here in front of the Hall. In fact, those 4 trees were all retained. So a lot of quite complex work going on there to identify what it was in the standard we needed to do and identify how we were going to do it. We persuaded the client to convert the listed building into a commercial space. So that is now available for rental. It has a number of uses in it. There's a small shop and a cafe and a number of small offices in there, and a room that the local community can use for meetings. And then we designed the scheme really to fit in around all of that. So you enter the scheme here. There's a sort of a entrance park area, so you can see the Hall, from 2 sides. See the historic building from 2 sides. A small parking area here, surrounded by every type that we used in the development. So with a speculative development, you always have to sell stuff. So we decided we would create essentially a little show village at the entrance where every typology is there, and we built some of those quite early on. So people could come along, visit them, buy them, and then that would help to fund the whole development. And then the spine route through, so we've got a road here that runs and connects to an existing road here. So that became the kind of spine of the development. And then along that, on both sides, we've got houses. And then at the back here, we've got another road that fronts over the parkland that we created because we weren't allowed to build on it. And we put some allotments in there, not because we had to, but because we thought that was going to be a nice idea. So we were kind of going a little bit beyond the brief in terms of how we could introduce sustainable living into the community. And then the rest of the open space here is converted into parkland. There's a walking trail, there's a small play space for children. And then as you go around the development, you have here and all the way along here, in fact all the way around here is a wall. So this was originally a walled garden, so sort of 18th century manor house type building where frankly local people weren't welcome unless they were servants. And there's also a part of a wall here. So this was a kind of walled garden. This area was the walled garden of the original building where they grew their produce and vegetables that they ate in the building. So the character of this area is quite dense, and you'll see later on that it's quite very closely knit, whereas further out here, this is more sort of relaxed and a bit more suburban. So it goes from quite hard-edged, particularly these little courtyard spaces, quite hard-edged, and then it sort of relaxes as you go to the perimeter. And then a lot of this is 3 stories, and then most of this is 2. And then we have 2 ranges of quite formal-looking houses in 2 terraces flanking the formal garden to create that sort of frontage to the whole. So the sort of economic activity, if you like, is concentrated at the front, so the hall itself. Originally, we had proposed an energy centre here at the front. So deliveries, biomass deliveries to that would come in, be delivered, and then the truck will go out again without having to go through the whole development. That was the plan. And then also use this as a sales centre. And then in terms of the water courses, so there's a suds and swale system here which brings the water from the surfaces together all the way down to the existing pond. And then you can see the number of different existing habitats that are retained. And then in terms of the uses, so we've got sort of formal gardens, we've got the sort of the commercial heart of the scheme, we've got the local doctor's surgery, which is already there, the NHS facility, which is already there, and then linking those up with some other uses like allotments and greenhouses. So the starting point, so we won the competition in early 2008, just about the time when the financial crash happened. So the kind of bottom fell out of the market pretty much at the time when we got planning permission for the scheme. And also we had a very expensive solution. So the costs of developing this biomass plant, which was intended to provide hot water to the whole development, was about £1.5 to £2 million. And there were only 1 or 2 other similar plants in the world, and none of them were in the UK. So it used gasification system. So what it does is, what it would have done was it would have heated waste to, I think, 400 degrees, at which point all the gases are pushed out of the material, and then you burn the gas in a normal CHP engine. Wonderful technology, but costs an absolute fortune. We also figured out by that stage that in order to make this work with a heat network around the development, we were going to spend roughly half the biomass in the ground. So in other words, of the heat you produce, by the time it gets to low-rise dwellings, you lose about half of it in transit. That didn't seem to us to be a kind of a brilliant solution. So on paper we were going to be zero carbon, because all the heat energy for the buildings was coming from renewable sources. But in reality, we were going to have trucks bringing in biomass, and every 50% of those trucks was going to be used to heat the ground. And we had a very expensive system, of which there are only a few in the world. And maintaining that, the history of biomass CHP plants, generally speaking, is a tricky one. There aren't that many of them in use at this kind of scale around the world. And the ones that are used have a fairly poor history of maintainability. Then came various changes of government, changes of attitude, and so on. And the Zero Carbon Hub was set up to look into a more easily adoptable zero carbon standard which would be brought in 2016. And that looked at how you could make buildings as efficient as possible from the fabric side, what's called the fabric energy efficiency side, and then for whatever carbon was left when you'd built the buildings with very, very high efficiency and you'd reached certain targets for the amount of kilograms of CO2 emitted, what was left you would then essentially put into an offset scheme called allowable solutions. The current government decided not to proceed with this in about 2015, but meanwhile we had gone ahead and built the scheme according to those standards. So we avoided spending the money on the biomass plant and the underground heat network, and we spent it instead on the fabric of the buildings, some renewable energy on the buildings, and then we worked with several of the local schools to replace the lighting in the schools with LED systems. And I think there was some local street lighting was changed as well. And in terms of tons per CO2 avoided and costs, that was a much, much cheaper thing to do rather than to spend the money on the biomass plant. So it's quite an interesting sort of evolution there in terms of the thinking, where you try and achieve zero carbon at all costs within the limits of the development on the one hand, or you accept actually there's an economic penalty to pay and you can use that money slightly more wisely to reduce the same tons of carbon elsewhere more efficiently. So then in terms of the movement and the sort of layout of the scheme, as I said, we were trying to connect the whole to the surrounding environment, so sort of a permeable kind of edge of the scheme, with the heart of the development still as the old institution. And it was interesting during consultation events that lots of the local people that we met had some relationship to the Hall. So some people had been there for parties, they used to organize parties maybe at Christmas. Some people had relatives who had worked there because there had been a lot of staff. So I think generally speaking, local people were pleased to see that something was happening to the Hall, that it wasn't going to fall into disrepair. And also they were quite excited at the prospect of being able to actually get onto the site and walk around it, because generally speaking in their lifetime it had been a closed and protected area. An important point of all of this is that during the design phase, in fact during the competition phase, we looked around at who had done highly successful schemes, and there weren't many that had gone as far as we were trying to go. But Kingspan were one of the companies who had done quite a bit of research and innovation. So we engaged with them and we brought them into the team effectively at an early stage. And for a house builder to do that, that's quite rare. House builders like to leave the construction decisions at the last possible moment and then buy whoever is cheapest in the market. They don't like to make the decision up front because it sort of puts them at economic risk and essentially leaves them with one partner that are going to buy stuff from. But we persuaded them on the basis that this was going to be extremely difficult technically, and what they needed to do was to make sure that they had a commercial partner, a technical partner like Kingspan, who could deliver on some of the technical requirements. And so the construction methodology was that we designed buildings which were as simple to construct as possible, and that the details were as foolproof as possible, because the energy requirements were very demanding. So we had to try and make sure that these buildings were going to be easily built to take out the risk of them failing. So we went through the designs with Kingspan and changed them many times during the process. And then they took on the task of realizing the envelope. So Kingspan engaged a company to work with them and their systems to build the envelope, including installing the windows. And then they handed over that envelope to Barrett's, who then put in kitchens and bathrooms and finished the internals and the externals. So that was quite an unusual process, but one that worked extremely well. So the buildings are built from SIPS panels, which are delivered as story height units. They're about the size of those those panels at the back of the room. So if you imagine, a lot of those arriving on a truck, then they're craned off the truck with a small mobile crane. The foundations are created separately using relatively traditional methods, although with a very low U value in the very highly insulated slab. And then those panels are simply dropped onto that and then fixed together, both glued together and then pinned together with sort of nails, which are about that long. Quite an impressive process watching it go together. And it takes about 2 days to erect a dwelling. And then Barratt's could then spend as long as they liked, because it was all weatherproof and airtight and so on. So Barratt's could then spend as long as they liked to then finish off the interiors and put on the roof and so on. So, and then in parallel to all of this, while we were working out the technical pros and cons of different solutions and the fabric typologies and the energy typologies and all those other things which went into meeting parts of the code and meeting all the other standards, the landscape architects were meanwhile working out things like the street layouts and patterns, the types of trees. We also had restrictions on the types of species, so the species are all native species. And the architecture team were designing typologies to go on the site and discussing with Barratt's sales and marketing team whether or not they could sell the homes, because companies like Barratt's, house builders generally speaking, try and build standardized house types, and there was nothing standardized about any of what we were doing here. Not only were the house types radically different from anything that they had built in terms of technology, they were different in terms of the layout, there were different in terms of the performance, they were different insofar as every end or every corner was a bit different from many of the others. So we had a tricky task of trying to, on the one hand, meet the demands of the brief and make sure that they got planning permission on this site, because this had the attention of Historic England, it had the attention of English Heritage, it had the attention of the Homes and Communities Agency, who were paying for it all, it had the attention of the local authority, it had the attention of DCLG. Everybody was watching what we were doing on here to see, is this working? Is this okay? Can we publish information on this? So as we progressed, and actually we had an extremely good engagement with South Gloucestershire. So we had regular sessions with South Gloucestershire where all our disciplines, so myself and my colleagues from planning and landscape, would come down to Bristol, and their equivalents, so their design team, the planning officer and the, say, urban space people, their play space people, the social housing people, would all come together every 2 weeks, and we had sort of a full afternoon session during the detailed design phase of the project. So we worked very closely together and with their team. And we also had a day here in Bristol, actually, at ARUP's offices. ARUP's were involved in the early stages of the project. So we had a day in ARUP's offices here with the entire project team. So practically every member of each discipline who was working on it from ARUP's. So we had about 5 teams from ARUP's from different parts of the country came together. People dealing with water, people dealing with fire, people dealing with heritage, people dealing with structures, and then our architecture teams, my team, our landscape team, our planning team. And we spent the day telling each other what we were doing and why, so that everybody in the team, the people who were dealing with the water, understood what the energy was about, and vice versa. Because when you're trying to meet technical standards, what you don't need is somebody saying, well, I need a pipe that runs from here to here, and then finding that you can't do that because there's some other stuff in the way. Both of them are necessary, but then neither of the two know why why no one can budge. So you need to get everybody together at some point or other in one of these complex projects and explain to everybody why things need to be done in a particular way. And then we did that again after we got planning permission, because as often happens, some of the technical team changes, people move on. I think we had about 5 people who had babies in the middle of the process, so we needed to kind of introduce the new people into the project. So So when you come then from the entrance area through here, one of the other features that we had was another part of that walled garden. And because it was south-facing and we couldn't put buildings against it, we had the idea of putting greenhouses against it. Again, it was something that wasn't called for in the brief, but it was just a little bit of space that seemed to have a perfect use. So, that's been done, and they are also rented out to residents. So like the allotments, the greenhouses and the allotments, they're rented out to residents. And there's a community interest company which runs the site, and that's part owned by the residents. So every resident who buys into the scheme becomes a shareholder in the community interest company. And then they get together. What's interesting is they get together at Christmas and Easter and other times, and they have events. So I lurk on their Facebook page, and it's always full of quite nice stuff. So what's been really interesting to us is the community aspects of the project. We kind of hoped that in the design of the buildings we would promote a sort of a social attitude of sort of a sustainable living and sharing, and some of that has been successful. And while we'd like to take credit for it, who knows whether we're right in doing so or not. And then, as I said, in the middle of the scheme, in the sort of walled garden area, there's a sort of two little squares here, because the arrangement of the buildings here are townhouses in front and then flats over garages at the back. So what happens is these people here have no road access to their houses. This is all pedestrian access. So they have to drive around the back here and park underneath. And we've organized it so that they've got two parking spaces, one under the garage and one in their garden. So if they must have two cars, they're going to have to lose some of their garden. That seemed to us to be kind of a nice trade-off. And also it means that we kind of avoid having the public realm full of cars. Although if you go there, what will you find? The public realm is full of cars. Partly because I think, as usual, when you create garage spaces, people don't like to use them. People also like to have more cars than they probably need. Or if they do need them, it's because the public transport system hasn't actually been improved very much in the area as much as we planned. There comes a point in some areas where you simply don't have control over aspects of the scheme. So over time, it'll be interesting to see how that changes, whether or not car ownership grows or diminishes. And then at the very edge of the area, we've got the pond here, we've got a play space here, and then the stream runs by. And then we've got these sort of lovely little spaces at the end where you've got a very private little open space where people can play in front of their houses, and sort of then be very close to the park. So if I was to live on the site, this is one of these houses here would be my personal favorite. In terms of the house typologies, then we have some quite large townhouses here. These are the ones that are on that terrace framing the house, the old house. So quite generous living spaces at the rear, a generous living room at the front overlooking the formal garden. Actually, that's a double height space. So you've got a sort of a mezzanine space and then a double height space. And then we've got a lot of cottage types. These, I'll show you a little bit more about those in a moment. But these are, again, this is one of the most unconventional homes where you come into the kitchen and living area here, a staircase at the back which takes you up to the living room here. There's no corridors, no hallways. So the bathroom here on the ground floor, bedroom here on the ground floor, bathroom here on the upper floor off the bedroom. And Barrett's were worried about whether or not they would sell these because they'd never designed or built anything like them. These were the first homes to sell in the scheme, and they said quite soon after they'd started selling that, can we change some of the scheme to include some more, because they're selling like hotcakes. So it's kind of a lesson for us and them, really. When clients say, oh, these will never sell, it's because they've never sold them before, they've never tried. But there is demand in the market, not just for unconventional typologies, but but for homes like this, which say are 2-bedroom houses, which are quite spacious. So quite a lot of them were bought by people who are retiring, or perhaps single-parent families. So one woman lives downstairs and her teenage son lives upstairs, and that's perfect for both of them because they don't need to get too much in each other's way. So we're not all the nuclear family anymore, if we ever were. So we need sort of flexible typologies that can respond to that. And we have a number of other typologies of this which get slightly deeper. The width stays the same, but the plan gets a bit deeper. It becomes a 3-bedroom and a 4-bedroom type. And then we've got a row of townhouses here which are quite urban. I mean, we would use these in a very urban situation where you enter on the ground floor, you've got a living kitchen diner at the back and a small bedroom at the front, and then the main living room is upstairs, overlooking the open space in front, and then 2 bedrooms again upstairs. So very tight packed homes, and we have a long terrace of those. And those were the last things to sell because they're quite urban in character compared to the rest of the scheme. So again, in terms of the organisation, you can see the townhouses here at the front with those flats over garages at the back. So these people have no parking space in the front. It's around here at the back underneath the flat. And then above that, there's a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. And those apartments are accessed from a balcony. These were an absolute utter nightmare because in terms of energy efficiency, the worst thing you can do is build a box and then lift it up in the air. So these things leak heat underneath and to the sides and to the front and the back and the top, so the worst possible scenario. So the energy efficiency of these has to work much, much harder than for practically every type.
How did you design them for lifetime homes?
For lifetime homes? Lifetime homes is a bit interesting. You don't have to have wheelchair accessibility to the front door. But you still have to have all these other. So we have apartments which are lifetime homes, but there's no lift. So these are in the same sort of scenario. They meet all the requirements, but you don't have to have a lift, which is a bit strange. So it's not the standard has some. And over the lifetime of the buildings, it'll be interesting to see whether or not some of the adaptations, some of them which are quite expensive, whether those adaptations are used or not. I think the jury's out on that. And then the cottage types. So you can see this is the ground floor entrance here, and then the staircase at the back of the kitchen, so this sort of kitchen dining area, and then the generous living room upstairs looking back over the open space. And then all of this is built out of those SIPS panels, so it's a very minimal sort of envelope, very simple, quite simple detailing, nothing too complex for people to build to make sure that we could get all of this built to the air tightness requirements that we needed. And then in terms of the arrangements, so the bathrooms stack, so the services stack, bathrooms stack, bedrooms stack, living rooms stack. So it's a very simple organisation, a very simple arrangement, but quite unconventional. And yet, as I said, they were the first ones to sell. And the people who live in them, I think, really enjoyed them because these windows are very high and very tall, so there's beautiful daylight comes in from here. The screens, which are such a strong feature of the architecture, they're there because we were worried about overheating. So we had to meet this overheating standard. So we brought in these screens, and then we thought, well, we'll bring them down to the ground. This drawing doesn't show that, but the later version brings them down to the ground. And we tilted them forward so that we could create a sort of a veranda space in front of the house. So that became a kind of a social space where people can sit out. And as you'll see in some of the photographs a bit later, that's become a very successful part of the scheme. And some people, the more outgoing, gregarious people in the project, have kind of really embraced that. So they have a balcony. They have a balcony here, and then they have a terrace here to sit out on. And most of them have a patio at the back. Now, in terms of normal housing, you could take away all of that. So you could build this, but you could take away all of that, and you'd have a perfectly acceptable, satisfactory house type. So the thing, we were criticised by Barrett's a lot because these are quite expensive homes. But our response to them was, well, you wouldn't have won the competition had they not been quite interesting homes to design. So there's always the tension in these kinds of projects between something that's going to win the competition on the one hand and grab the attention of the jury, and something that's affordable and practical to build. We probably went a little too far towards the sort of competition winning, but I don't regret it because it's a wonderful scheme. But what's interesting too is that the homes, when these went on the market, so one of the vagaries of the housing market, when these went on the market, they were sold at the same value as a 3-bedroom house or a 2-bedroom house in the local area. So they were sold at sort of 250, 300,000 in the local area because a valuer says, what can I give you a mortgage for? I can only give you a mortgage for something that I'm confident will sell again. So they value them based on the local area. But the resale value is a bit different. So when they've been resold, a handful of them have been resold, and they've been resold at 25% greater value. So then you kind of think, well, that's not very helpful for the developer, is it? Because they spent probably 25% more than they normally would to build these homes, but they couldn't get any of that back in the sales. Whereas the people who bought them actually then made a substantial profit when they resold them.
How much did each unit cost to make including construction?
We don't know. This is what happens when you work with a house builder. They'll tell you what they want to tell you, and they won't tell you the rest. So we don't know. But I reckon they were at least 25% above what would then have been a normal build cost. So that a normal build cost for them would have probably have been about £850 a square metre in those days. I would have thought they had to spend at least 1,000 then. And so they finished that 4 or 5 years ago. Today, it would probably be 1,800, something like that. Part of the brief was some post-occupancy evaluation. So various people, including your colleague Sonia, has been doing some work on the site in various ways over the years. So this is one of the results from, I think, Syria's, Bizria, not Syria, Bizria. So predicted annual gas consumption of all the units on the green line, and then actual consumption here. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? That sort of, until you get about halfway along, you can see we're kind of there or thereabouts, and then we start to diverge. So it's people who are essentially using more energy than they probably need to. So the other big issue with all of this is that you can create the kind of environment within which people can live very sustainable lives, but you have zero control over what they actually do with it after you moved away. I mean, this person down here at the end, you got to wonder what they're doing. Are they either not there a lot of the time, or are they kind of wearing sort of 2 layers of thermal underwear? I have nothing against 2 layers of thermal underwear. I think that's an excellent strategy. And then in terms of overall dwelling satisfaction, I love this one because, temperature in winter, so the average satisfaction is between 4 and 5. So out of 5, how satisfied are you? So it's between 4 and 5 all the way along, except for the controls of the heating system and except for controls of the ventilation system. So the only thing that people were frustrated by and annoyed by are the controls. So, there's still a chunk of design work to be done. And I'm sure this is not unusual. There's still a chunk of design work to be done on the usability of controls. Google's Nest and various other people are doing a lot of work on that. And all of that is a good thing, because even after all those years of putting these systems in fact, one resident has created a user guide to the mechanical ventilation systems, which he then distributes to new residents when they come in. So it's always quite amusing. A new resident comes onto the Facebook page and says, how do I turn off the boost function on the MVHR? And someone says, here's the guide. So that's really satisfying, when the people who are in the buildings are actually helping new people to manage them. So in terms of the final scheme, one thing I would say, the technical team at Barratt's were superb. You know, they really, really knew their stuff. They really, really understood construction. So the refurbishment work of the whole, you know, produced a fantastic building, beautiful building. Well worth just a walk around and a look at it. And then the construction of the buildings themselves, you know, was superb. So the quality of what was finished, you know, given that these are people who are often used to building relatively standardized things, I was really impressed by how well they did it. And actually they loved it as well. I mean, a number of them said to me at the end of the project, you know, I'm really sad about this because now I'm going to go back to doing kind of normal stuff, and it's not going to be really as challenging and interesting and exciting, you know. So that was a kind of a good lesson to me too, that when people tell you how difficult things are going to be to get other people involved in, you know, that's rubbish. Everybody in all levels of the industry loves a challenge, and they love something interesting. And they like to do something difficult. So this is a view of the pond. It's been substantially enlarged. There are ducks on it now, and there are lots of frogs. So you know, the children are always sort of collecting frogs and putting them back in the pond. I think there was a heron there for a while, but I think it left disappointed because there are no fish in there. So you can see the houses. This is a row of houses close to the green belt. And people's behavior about the shutters is interesting. So we have fixed screens on the front, fixed louvers to cut out a lot of the sunshine. And then we have shutters on the other windows to make sure that, you know, people can close them up and avoid overheating. And what people do is they kind of close the house up at night, a lot of them, or they close it up when they leave for the day. So they pull the shutters across. And the result is, I think, rather interesting and beautiful, because everybody knows what a shutter is. You know, you don't need to train someone on how to use a shutter. So it's, again, in the battle for which kind of strategies do you go for? Do you go for something that's automated and complex and requires maintenance, or do you go for something that can just be pulled across? So if you design it well enough and you make it obvious enough, people will use it. This is an apartment building in the middle of the scheme. So that's the old wall on the left. Beautiful old stone wall, which has the greenhouses behind. And then those were apartments for sale on the right. Again, apartments sold very quickly. And again, there was suspicion at Barratt's, you know, whether or not people in that area would want to buy apartments. And you can see a little bit here of how people are starting to occupy the frontage here. So some deck chairs and some plants. People starting to kind of make use of that space. And then this is the cycle route, which connects up to the existing cycle route on the main road nearby. The wood is stained with a copper-based material. So it is cedar, which is stained with something called microshades, which has a 20-year guarantee to it. So it's going to be interesting again to see how well the wood lasts in terms of coloration and character and appearance. So again, you see people sort of taking advantage of the sort of veranda type space. Now many of these were taken about 2 years ago. So if you go back now, you know, all this vegetation is much richer and lusher by now, and things have moved on quite a bit. So while quite a bit of this was put in by us at the start, your residents have continued to add to it as they live there.